ago, in high school, whenever the teacher would say, take a break, I had a high school teacher, he would say, get done, he'd say, okay, guys, smoke them when you got, smoke them if you got them. About smoking cigarettes. I had a teacher talk about that. That just seems so amazing to me today. So I still always think about that, because that my beloved first grade teacher would smoke in his class. I was not seeing him. I said, so awesome. Yeah, she did die long. Yeah, I know. It's so sad. Yeah.
And I would never take the teacher up on a smoker.
I would not be surprised if somebody, there were more people smoking back then. This is a different world. Because I remember going to a restaurant and just being surrounded by all the other tables and everyone smoking. You sit down in a restaurant, there'd be the ashtray full of ashes. That's a nice thing to us. That's a pretty horrible. It's a sad habit that people get into, they can't get out. Speaking of that, let's get to, what was the idea? That the war was fought for a noble purpose, the Civil War. Yeah. Yeah, the lost cause. What became the symbol of the lost cause and states' rights? And therefore, what's the law that segregated the South? We lump, even though technically the voting restrictions are outside of Jim Crow, we kind of lump them together. But technically, they're outside of it. And to me personally, it's embarrassing that countries around the world that try to establish some kind of racial controls look to Jim Crow as a role model. And I don't want that. I like when people look at the United States and say, boy, that Declaration of Independence is great, not Jim Crow. But also, and Reconstruction was not actually this attempt to bring equality, new economy. It was actually what?
The North tried to dominate the South.
Yeah, they actually invaded to dominate. Even brought what kind of misrule would they say? Yeah, which is that's horrible, but and it was quite effective. And you got to remember, most people, regardless of color or skin, don't have much money. So who are you going to blame? Yeah, the people with money, or those other people who are taking your job or making it more difficult because they want to be equal. You divide people up by color of skin. Okay, so let's get to the American West, because while this is booming, we have the last big expansion west. We've talked a little bit about California and Oregon, but this area here, the last territories, and this will also be the last group of American Indians that would still be independent after the Civil War. There would be a couple major fights in California here, but disease had ravaged them. Just as I talked about disease ravaging here, but here, they're still there, partially because the United States at first didn't really want that land. I'll tell you why in just a second. And you see, Montana became a territory in 1864. It was right during the time, right during the war, yeah. They have no votes towards presidency. They have no votes. They have no senators, no members of the House. But a territory has a form of government. And so usually what happens is the federal government the federal government sets up the law. But in most territories of the United States, the federal government allows for territorial government to make the individual laws within the territory.
Okay.
They got to go through a process to be approved by Congress to become state. And originally they have to have a certain population to make it. That goes way back to the Northwest Ordinance. Remember, it's 1787. That's when that was created. So, for example, Puerto Rico is a massive territory of the United States. And technically they have self-rule, but the United States government can actually literally overturn those laws. Or Washington, D.C., same thing, that's a territory. And they technically have self-rule, but the federal government controls it. And Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. cannot go for president.
Yeah.
So as you, going back a little bit to the amendments, when you write amendments, do you write them in the same ambiguous style as when it was initially written, or do you update it? So like, eventually, if we eventually like get anything amended, he's gonna have like modern.
All laws are written in unison, so capital A.
Okay.
They'll keep doing
still,
that.
like, have the old fashioned writings.
And the writings out, but that's one thing about law. Law is very archaic, anachronistic, goes back in time. The one thing about the law is we have old established law. We know what the law is that's been established long ago, so they keep it simple. If you talk, and it's written by lawyers, and part of the reason is job security. You know?
Yeah.
I'm very good friends who are lawyers. I took the LSAT and decided I didn't want to law. So
The ambiguity of the laws and the ways that in my Supreme Court cases are so often tied to determine what is and isn't the law.
well, the Supreme Court, remember, they gave themselves the Constitution. This Constitution doesn't say anything about the Constitution. The Supreme Court gave themselves. So that's part of the thing. It's laws are so hard to define that it opens itself up to those interpretations. Opens itself up there. But remember, I think I told you that before. Well, I know I did. The Supreme Court gave themselves the power of judiciary. So back to this in the West. And so the tribes live here, massive villages, very dense population, farmers, agricultural, same along here. I mean, they were different, but actually, there's a really big difference between the tribes right here and the tribes here. Just because these are different, it's like there's different anywhere. But still, also women had much more power outside of the plains. Plains Indians, women had more power, economic and political, the runnings of the tribe, more power than, let's say, the United States did. But the Plains Indians were much more male dominant. But still, those were the last ones still holding out. And these Plains Indians, please. Oh, so these are the plains. The plains are this last area that the United States would conquer. And part of the reason why it was so dry. When Zebulon Pike went through this one, part of the problem is now any kind of light off the snow, it really hits here. When Zebulon Pike went through this area here into the plain, into Colorado, he encountered these massive sand dunes. These are called the Nebraska sandhill country. It's really weird. You feel like you're in the Sahara Desert. I mean, these rolling sand hill. They look exactly like the desert, even though it rains about 20 to 22 inches of rain. I mean, maybe 19 to 20. It's not a desert per se, but it looked like one. So he dubbed it the Great American Desert. He just thought, oh, it's going to be all desert. His thought was, okay, desert, and then more fertile land would get across the mountains. And so with that, just for the United States to settle that land, they found the desert. We just want to get through it as quickly as possible. And so that allowed the Plains Indians to survive longer. They had other reasons why too. And let's not do our music in here right now during class. And with that, oh, this also shows some of the biggest battles, almost all the battles that most people talk about for the United States versus the various American Indian tribes. Not the big ones happen, or the most prominent happened in the plains. But I should add, the battles here, like for example, the battle of Fallen Timbers or Tippecanoe, or my mind froze. A really big battle in 1813 against the Creek. My mind just totally froze. Yes.
Assuming the thing those maps, they just probably that's like doing different part.
Normally it was. I should change that. It'll come to me in a second. God, I can't believe my mind. Huh? Why can't I remember? Oh, it's weird when you're in front of people trying to think of everything you're going to say. How easy it is to forget words. Just incredible. Learning to speak in public is a good time. Two of the best classes I took in college were acting, and I didn't have to class. You should. I stole every scene. And awful public speaking. It was awful. It was hard, but it makes you do things. But it's easy to forget things. He'll come to me in a sec. Bandit, I can see it. Lost it. I mean, I can see, okay, he'll come back. Those battles were bigger, and those were more decisive for the future of tribes attempting to stop the United States. But these are some of the most famous, and Montana had one of the most famous, the Battle of Little Big One. But they're relatively small. And part of the reason, I should have one more thing. And so when American settlers were going westward, they're trying to get over this as quickly as possible and go to California. So there would be conflicts along the various trails, but trying to get there as fast as possible. And one more thing. The first, they called them penny novels, started having cheaper publishing practices and quick stories, and they put them in these new magazines that had cheaper publishing practices, better machines. In the late 19th century, the most popular stories would be about the American West. And those are stories about who? The most popular early movies? Here, the West. It was the Clintons. The most popular early television shows? Here. The most popular American exports of entertainment in the 30s and 40s would be those movies. You go to Britain or Europe, wherever that be. And so that's what people think about. So, very quickly, let's talk about the Plains Indians. And the Plains Indians, rather nomadic, they had to be, by definition, and the tribes had to be small. If you're moving all the time, you can't be too big. And if it rains less than 20 inches a year, it's going to be very difficult to stay in one place. You have to move and follow the food. And so they're going to be intimately tied to the bison, following the herds of bison. And the numbers are hard, really hard to get. Anywhere from 20 to 30 million bison along the Great Plains, probably about 1,500. That number would go up to maybe 50 million by the late 1790s as disease limited the number of hunters, but then the numbers would drop dramatically. It's probably down to maybe 30 million. I've seen figures of 20 to 30 million in the 1840s bison. There'd be just barely 2,000 by 1800. Gone. The whole, in fact, it's a miracle there's any left, and I'm not exaggerating. It's just amazing there's any bison. But they would follow, and that's one of the things where very hard to hunt a bison, but the bison could provide basically anything to eat, also tools. But that is why if you're on foot, you see these in Europe and also Asia, every place else. But if you ever went up just a little bit near Ulm and gone to the buffalo jump there, and there's another one on the way to Bozeman, and the remarkable ingenuity, people are incredibly smart to figure out ways to drive buffalo over some kind of cliff. And I will say the one by Ulm, I'll never forget the first time I was there and I was walking on the cliff and I thought, nobody'd be fooled by this. I made a little bend and it really does look like the ground just keeps going. You could see how you could fool somebody. I mean, you have to be very, very clever to use that. What would change everything was when an American animal made its reemergence with the Spanish, the horse. And that picture is supposed to be in front of that, but for some reason it's behind. Why didn't I change that very quickly? Yeah, when the first big wave of humans came over the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, going the other way were horse and a few other animals. The humans ate all the horse because they're yummy, right? And so the horse went extinct in the Americas, over hunting, and then it disrupted their entire breeding patterns and they all died out. But then the Spanish brought them back. And this would radically shift the plains. And when people think about Plains Indians, it's almost how perpetually tied with their ability on some levels. And I mentioned a little bit about the Comanche and how incredible they were. On horseback, you could almost say the same thing about the northern tribes. Think about Montana. You might think about the Assiniboine, the Arikara, the Lakota, a little bit further south, the Crow, just natural on horse. And this would change the entire hunting dynamic. One thing that would help the United States when the United States was conquering. You have groups on horseback, they would move, but they hard to come in contact. They could move a lot faster on horse. A lot more contact, a lot more war, so the US could divide and conquer. Yeah.
There is evidence to suggest that horses were originally from the American.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty much it. So it's weird to think about because I remember being at school and just being taught the horses for Spanish, you know? That is weird kind of way it made the whole spiral coming back. Yeah. And so with that, but what about disease? One other advantage they have competitively to the Eastern tribes. The diseases would ravage them, but as they're more spread out by necessity because there's so much less rain, so much less moisture, they weren't as much contact. And so they had a little bit of a competitive advantage for disease. No, I'm not saying the disease would not kill them. Right after Lewis and Clark went to the Mandan village, the massive Mandan village, like many thousands of people in their present day Bismarck. Trappers that came a little bit later brought smallpox. So the same kind of thing happened as it's going to happen, as we said before here. And yes, I'll change the map now. Okay, so with that, and oh, let me go back one thing here too. They would farm. They would farm on bottomlands, a lot of times plant crops or at least cultivate crops that were there, move, come back. And the Plains Indian, the normal routine would be to move all summer into relatively small bands, spread out, try to get as much food as possible, and in the winter come into bigger bands and hunker down for the winter. And I guess those winter camps, obviously cold and all that, but just they were known for just being these very open camps, allowing people in. Always had plenty of food because they were easy to kill during the summer and preserve the meat. Known as being very gregarious. You know, kids running around. There'd be a lot of one-eyed Plain Indians, I should add. They all practice bow and arrow against each other. They might not add the arrowhead, but I think you can see what's going to happen. Of course, when I was a kid, we had played bow and arrows and we shoot at each other. And yes, I got hit in the face. I don't want to think about it. Do they still even sell the little arrows? They don't sell those anymore, little arrows with plungers on them. Yeah, we would have ones that without the plungers. And you could have target practice. Okay, moving on. We see a little bit of a farm there. And so this would be one of the scenes, but now by horseback would make the hunting of bison just change so dramatically. And the bison would be used everything from the fur, which is really thick, scrape, let dry, be used for teepees or along the frontier. Oh, by the way, the teepee is perfectly designed to move fast, move quickly. Of course, I'm always in awe of people who put together a teepee quickly. Has anyone ever tried to put up a teepee? It's
hard.
It's really hard, but now when you know what you're doing, I imagine you have to be very talented. Yeah, a lot of people know what they're doing, and when I did it, was a bunch of us yahoos, and then someone laughing at us who knew what they were doing. But and then every single part could be used, and so the bison would have just incredible importance beyond just food. In fact, one of the big deals was once killing a bison would be to show, I mean, it was almost like a ritual. Cut open as quickly as possible. Pull out the liver. Season it with bile from the gallbladder and eat it right there. Still seasoned. It's pretty good. Okay, everyone has different eating. Let's so we'll move on. And don't forget, they didn't have the wheel. And it's not because they weren't smart. They were really smart, incredibly smart. But the horse didn't come to the 15th and 16th century. They had nothing to pull. Why would you ever invent a wheel if you have nothing to pull? And then by the time they had the horse, they already had their practices down. They used to pull the teepees by hand, they'll just attach the logs to the poles to the horse. Well, with these tribes still holding out, the Oregon Trail would be the first big contact besides the original fur traders, which I've talked about before. Fur traders only a few, but the Oregon Trail went through these plains and through this hunting ground. And there were some conflicts between the initial citizens of the United States going through this land, but they were trying to get through as quickly as possible, not just the Oregon Trail. This would turn eventually called the Mormon Trail all the way around to LA, and I told you a little bit about that. The Santa Fe Trail went here, the Oregon cutoff. But right here was one of the first U.S. Army forts in the Great Plains called Fort Laramie. In 1851, they signed a treaty basically saying that land there would be tribal land forever. Forever. But remember, I've told you about this before. The Treaty of Grenville, right there, for example, said forever too. But the United States had an insatiable hunger for land. And not only that, once the American Indians signed this treaty, and yeah, they knew they were kind of lying to it. No, they did not know what extent. I mean, just know, oh yeah, we want this land, we're going to take it. But by signing this, they acknowledged that they're part of the United States. They acknowledge, therefore, they're no longer really independent. Do you remember the treaty that's way back when, Cherokee versus Georgia? And it said that the reservations were dependent domestic nations. By signing this treaty, they've accepted that they are domestic within the United States. And once they sign that, that would be used as an excuse to force other treaties down the road. And then eventually used as an excuse to say, the heck with the treaties, we're just going to make you go on reservations. Do you understand that point, that they now accept? And, you know, they didn't know. And they were being tricked. And so with that, this shows, now this map is a little bit inaccurate because it shows all this area as part of land that was owned by American Indians, and that's not quite true. Remember, this was Spain and then Mexico. But still, here it is accurate. And piece by piece, all this land would be taken by the United States. Now, the people there would fight, but think about it, there's not very many on the plains. So they're going to be outnumbered, no matter how brave you are. The technology, the lack of food, and we'll get to that too. The first major incursion, though, into the plains would be mining. I know you're thinking mining's in the mountains. But this means larger numbers than ever before are going to go into the plains and stay in the plains as like supply areas. Well, think about a best example of that would be a town that's like Denver. Denver is still, if you've been to Denver, you know, it's all plains and then the wall of mountains. That's in the plains as a central area to supply the mines further in the mountains. And so that's an example of what's going to happen. And so the first miners would come in. Now they're getting across this line going in mining. Here are some of the first type of mining, placer mining. You know, we live in Helena, Montana. My guess is in elementary, junior high, you've probably done a little bit on placer mining and all that, using a pan. Very inefficient way to mine in the water. Eventually there'd be more hard rock mining. Here's a sluice from a hard rock mine. Always involved in water, very water intensive, use the water to, at the end they would leave a sluice and somebody use it. Hydraulic mining was very prominent, but hard rock tunnel mining, we're not quite to the open pit mining yet, but this is going to require a lot of workers. Boom towns are going to appear, and this is going to dramatically change life on the plains. Dramatically. All these areas in gold here are the various gold mines in the 19th century. It's kind of shocking, isn't it? Some would be bigger, some were smaller, but every one would be a quick boom. All these people would come in, and the people who come into these mining towns need things. And they got to come across the plains or get it from the plains. So the first big mines were gold and silver. I've talked about this before, but gold is one of the products that people use to hold value. And I think I told you why, because gold doesn't do what, if you remember? Yeah, it doesn't rust and tarnish. Silver does tarnish, but not as much as, let's say, brass or I'm sorry, bronze or that kind of thing, or it doesn't rust. Gold or silver. And during the Civil War, when the United States was spending money like mad, gold became a premium. So 1849, and there were a couple other gold strikes, but right before and then right in the beginning of the Civil War was a massive, oh, almost forgot. And then after that, copper, zinc, lead, other minerals too, nickel. A lot would be used for production of steel. Copper would be used for what? What's coming? I think, yeah, electrical wires. Wherever there's steel, I'm sorry, wherever there's silver, wherever there's silver, there's copper. It's the way it is. So Butte had gold, they tapped that out, but silver. When silver prices dropped, Butte was about ready to die. Just with the second industrial revolution in electricity. And that would change everything. And then, yeah. There's not as much silver. Okay. Yeah. And so silver, there's not as much silver. And silver also was a value holder, at least till then. So it was higher value. So it was more expensive to use for all the copper market. Good question. Yeah. Copper is also a little more pliable. Yeah. That's a really good question. If you drive south to Butte and look at the mountains, if you drive to Butte, look to the mountains to get my direction for it, to the east. And you see these kind of gray areas on the mountainside, that's copper and silver. You get a shovel, we'll go. It's really low grade. It costs too much, but. And so Comstock Low, right here, Virginia City, Nevada, would be a boom right at the beginning of the Civil War. In fact, that's how come Lincoln was able to, and the Republicans were able to rush through Nevada as a state during the war. Because so many people went to the Comstock Lode in Virginia City. And yes, to copy it, that's why Virginia City, Montana is named that. We're going to be just as big. Didn't quite turn out to be as big. And then massive mines in Colorado almost right after it. Denver just exploded to supply this, and Denver still is that kind of that central commercial hub. You know, Denver now is massive. And I really like, that's one thing about Colorado, you can really see the dramatic change between the plains, wall of mountains. That dramatic change. And then what state would be the next big one? You all know it, because you're sitting there, Montana. That's why Montana became a territory in 1864. And it had the power to make not just the big Idaho territory and then this be Montana, but the whole thing. We could take it all. Right? The heck with Idaho. But all of these things, they need supplies. People come through, supply depots. And one of the big things, they need food. And that means people are going to follow. And what's the quickest source of food nearby? Bison. And that's going to directly affect the Plains Indians. Directly. So before, the people would be relatively quick through, there'd be inconveniences. I mean, they could see there's all this sea of people coming, but it doesn't seem as big of a threat. And then overnight in the 1860s, massive threat along the plains to the American Indian tribes. But they had no idea what's coming. Because in 1862, during the war, with the South gone, the Lincoln administration got the Transcontinental Railroad bill passed. This huge government program to build the railroads. 1862, massive program. Now, it wasn't the US government building the railroads. The US government was going to pick two companies to build the railroad and give them almost unbelievable, I want to say almost unbelievable amounts of money. Now, what was the philosophy that a lot of people that were starting this new thing of capitalism all believed in, that this seemed to go against? Huge government aid to just a couple companies. Well, no, it's helping create monopoly, philosophy that just go against with the government. What's it called? You remember laissez-faire, hands off by government? And all the capitalists say they like laissez-faire. But what else do they really like? Yeah, monopolies and big government aid. They like big amounts of money from taxpayers. This would never happen today. Let me tell you about Southwest Airlines. Moving on. You know what happened to Southwest Airlines during Christmas break? Yeah,
I would know. I was flying there on my way back from Ohio.
were you on Southwest or just at another airline?
I was flying West, frankly, I based on the third.
Yeah, because they canceled. They said 60, but I've seen as high as 80% of their flights on a couple days. Well, during COVID, the government gave hundreds of millions of dollars to the airlines so they could survive, just gave them money. When I mean government, I mean that's us. And they were supposed to keep their workers on during COVID because no one was flying.
Oh, and then
They just fired and let go of 30 workers.
Until the government learned to never bail out the airline company.
Because the airline companies give them lots of money.
those essential, it's an essential luxury in today's economics.
It's for the people on the railroads. So they let a third of the people go, pocketed the money, and gave themselves big stock benefits, dividends, pay their CEO. And so when the big storm in, that map, the big cold wave, they couldn't fly. Their system was so antiquated. They're so used to computer systems in the 1990s. It's so antiquated they couldn't adapt. They couldn't find pilots in the whole thing of the process. Needless to say, they're fine. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, could do something about it, but they're not doing it. They should fine them, but they won't. Massive government aid. And so, what was this aid? It's a kind of shocking amount of aid. First off, they gave them low interest loans. Now, this is actually 16,000. I just didn't want to type in the zeros. My fingers got tired. But $16,000 per mile if they built on planes. 1,600. 32 if they went on foothills. 4,800 if they went on mountains. For each mile, they could make a basically no interest loan. That is free money to the two companies and then other companies that built that railroad. I mean, just imagine if you had a company and you know the government is going to loan you an unlimited amount of money almost and no interest. Doesn't that change everything you do? If you ever if you're a family member, try to start a business, and how difficult it is to get that money, how scary it is to borrow that money. Like, no, we're getting free money. I'll pay interest on it. Wow. I've earned a raise. I'm going to buy a gold fielded toilet seat. Yes.
So the government is paying them
Build a rail.
by the month.
Yeah, by the month. It's no interest loan, so technically they have to pay it back. But, and they did.
And it probably wouldn't be hard.
Well, no. And think about it. If you're going to invest in a company, would you invest in the company that the government was giving them money? Or invest in the company that the government was not giving them money? Think about the company that they're giving them money. The government says, what about that company? They like them and want them to survive. Wasn't that a good investment? It's like free money. The same thing happened in the 2008 financial disaster. Maybe you guys lived through the Great Recession, the worst economic disaster to hit the world since the Great Depression. They gave the banks $770 billion of taxpayer money and up to $32 trillion. They basically just printed and gave them money to buy their bad investments. How are those banks doing now? Yes.
Most of us were 3 or 2 back then.
Should have done something about it. Where the heck were you people? Yeah, so the banks are now bigger than ever. The same people who are going to destroy the economy. That'll be another story for later on. And in special topics next semester, we will do the financial crash. And if you're in special topics class, and I'll tell you about that. It will make you furious. It just furious. So with that, also, do you notice this map? It has these big gray areas. Anybody want to guess what this is? Yes.
Areas with flat.
Land grants. They gave that land to the railroads. And that's not just the right of way. We're talking millions of acres. Millions of acres they gave to the railroads. Because think about what's going to be the most valuable land? The land next to a railroad because it's quicker to transportation. And they just gave it to the railroads. Okay, not quite all of that. This is actually a map for the Democratic Party saying, look what the Republicans did. This is just a complete giveaway. Almost half of the state of Iowa. Why do I say half? The land grants were in a checkerboard pattern. I know. I'm not sure how I did that, and I left it. I thought it was kind of funny. It was every other section, one by one section. So this would be, all the white would be government. The government would maintain and hold on to it. And by the way, I should add, this is the land taken from other people who lived there and now given to the railroads. You are sitting on land that was given to the Northern Pacific Railroad back in 1874. That's land you're sitting on. Yeah.
But all fairness, they would probably need a bunch of extra hands to build around the thing down there that faster, sand, and they need to tear out the railroad and create a railroad around it, and it would take a long time for it to safely.
Yeah, you're not incorrect, but this is 1,000 times more land than that. I mean, this is a massive amount of land. Because remember I said you were sitting on land that was given to the Northern Pacific Railroad? What city did the Northern Pacific Railroad go through? Butte. They didn't go through Helena. Went through Butte. That gives you an idea how much land they give. Yeah.
So now that they own this land,
Mhm.
would they
They just
so that it's there,
They just sold it to people. But they could sell for very high prices because there's near the railroad.
but for the
Or
natives,
rented.
for the natives.
The people, the American Indians who live there, they would, the American Indians didn't want to leave. So what's gonna happen? The government, the railroad will get more government aid in the form of the United States money. And so, that's checkerboard pattern, huge government aid. And so the first transcontinental railroad, don't think in terms of sea to sea, it was a railroad to connect with the eastern railroads right here and get to the railroads already being built in California. The Central Pacific went from Sacramento east. The Union Pacific went from Omaha west. And they didn't set a point where they would meet. The idea was they wanted a race. Because every mile your railroad went, that's more money. And they also got a lot more money for planes. It was a lot cheaper to move here for the railroads. A lot harder to go through the Sierra Nevadas, but they got more money. A lot more money. And there's a vested interest to say that planes were foothills. So they say, oh, there's a hill, it's a foothill, they're double. Or, oh, there's a couple of hills, it's mountains, and you double the amount. The Central Pacific Railroad and its manager, Leland Stanford, found a very compliant geologist who said these low hills just east of Sacramento were mountains. And so they could charge then $4,800 to the government per mile. When Stanford became governor of California, gee, I wonder how I got that job, but when he became governor, he would name the tallest mountain in not just California, but the continental United States after Josiah Whitney, Mount Whitney. Thank you for all the money you gave me. You get a mountain named after him. That's still the tallest mountain in the continental United States. Money. And so they moved this way very quickly. Needed lots of labor, and it would be start out with surveying crews, And then grading crews come through and flatten and level it. And then as quick as they could, lay down ties, rails, go. As fast as they could go. And the various tribes on the plain would attack some of those surveying crews. They could not, they knew. They didn't know the extent of what's coming, but they knew. And so the army would come out and protect the surveying crews. More government aid. I mean, that's direct government aid for business. And that gives you an idea of Nebraska. Think about every other section still, but look how much went to the railroads across Nebraska. That's just immense money. And there was no restriction saying they had to spend it on the railroad. They could also do what? Yeah, give themselves a raise because they're working so hard. The Northern Pacific Railroad was just a total scam. They would actually go bankrupt 5 times, even though they gave them all that money in land because they just pocketed it all. And so here's where the railroad went. Here, very high mountains. And someplace in here they would meet. The race was on. To build the Central Pacific Railroad, they sent contractors out to get labor in China. And so Chinese workers, remember sharecroppers, they were a little bit like that, or tenant farmers. I guess serfs are almost closer. The landlords would sell, they called it contracting, Chinese workers out to the Central Pacific Railroad. And their landlords back in China would take half their pay. And they worked the brutal job of trying to get over, here they are, using a hand drill to pound a tunnel into the Sierra Nevadas. Anyone ever been to the Sierra Nevadas? Beautiful mountains. They're just stunning, but they are tall. And thousands of Chinese workers would die trying to get over these mountains. Just keep working on through. The Union Pacific used former slaves, but also encouraged a lot of Irish immigrants, and they would take this name, a name that came from Ireland, called patties. And so these large work crews would come, and when they would lay down the ties, I mean, you notice how kind of haphazard these ties were. It's all speed. Just get as many miles as possible. They'd have to rip out the rails and redo the whole thing in the next 5 years. Because there was a race to get who's going to get the furthest miles. And instead of using 4 nails to or spikes to attach the rail to the ties, they used 1. Making it really dangerous, but they just want to move. In fact, when they got to Utah, the grading crews of the Central Pacific passed the Union Pacific and they just kept going. And finally, the US government said, you're going to meet in one spot. And they would meet in one of the most desolate places I've ever been in my life, just north of the Great Salt Lake, Promontory Point, Utah. If you get a chance, go there. It's really cool. But wow, is it just desolate. I mean, it is up in these high kind of salt, kind of these salty dunes you have to go through. They get in this high, almost desert. It rains about 3 to 4 inches a year. They thought a city would form up there, but nothing did. And they would, you might have heard about that. They did a gold spike, which they immediately took out. It's in the Railroad Museum in Sacramento. They took a silver spike. They also took put an amalgamated gold and silver spike. And the last spike was going to be a spike they would pound in, and it would connect 2 ends of a telegraph line. So it would go off in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. to show that the railroads are connected. And they did this symbolic celebration here. Last thing I'll tell you for today. So they have been celebrating all day and night. So you can imagine how strong it is. I'll tell you real quick. Leland Stanford was going to be the one to do that last spike to capture the telegraph lines. He was so drunk, they had to kind of fight him in the direction, and he and missed like 3 feet. The telegraph operator just hit the button. In Sacramento, they put up a big sign. California annexes the United States. Okay, so have a good weekend, everybody. Oh, yeah. Yeah, say goodbye.